Kathy. So I'm going to talk about an impact evaluation of Costa Rica's PES system, focusing on the early years of what was really a pioneering PES program. And this is joint work with Rodrigo, Paul, and Subrendu. We did this research in 2005, which is always easy for me to remember. That's when my son was born, and many of you have seen him here with me, so he's been living with this study his whole life. 2005 is also important because around that time, some initial impact evaluations were coming out with a finding that the impacts of Costa Rica's PES program didn't look that large. In fact, the impacts looked pretty small. And so we designed our study to focus on a case study region, Sarapiquí, where there was an NGO intermediary, Fundacor, that was doing some targeting that the national program wasn't doing at that time. So really trying to get landowners who were in areas where it looked like deforestation was likely to sign up. That also meant that because there was this strong intermediary there, the landowners got a lot of support. So in terms of socioeconomic impacts, you might think this is a place where landowners would be more likely to benefit. They had this facilitator that helped them write the forest management plans and enroll in the program. And the other important thing to note about our case study is that we did household surveys and we had parcel data. So we're able to look at impacts on entire farms, so not just the parcel under contract, but on the entire land area, the farm that the landowner is making decisions about. And in terms of socioeconomic impacts, then we can also look at impacts on the farm family. So I just want to continue with a little bit of a synopsis here. Starting with our previous result, which I think many of you have seen from this article published last year. We found that on average, having a contract on your farm increases forest cover by about 13% of the average contract area. So we call that a moderate impact. So this certainly verifies that the impact of PSA is not equal to the total area under contract, as all of you would expect, but it's also not tiny. There's a significant positive impact on forest cover on the farm. So the new question is, to get to that impact, how do farmers adjust their farm management and their livelihoods? So essentially, this is an example of the first stage analysis of potential mechanisms that Paul just referred to. So we're looking for evidence of PSA's impact on different possible mechanisms for changing forest cover on the farm. We care about this because we care whether our result is plausible, right? So we see increased forest cover. Do we see other changes in forest management that would make that increase in forest cover plausible? We also care about it because we want to know if this impact is desirable in some sense. So coming back to Stefano's point, do they increase forest cover but overgraze pastures in some other area of the farm, simply shift all the cattle somewhere else, or is the program helping them out of agriculture? So that's on the forest cover and the environmental side, and then also on the socioeconomic side, the welfare side, what's the impact of these adjustments on the welfare of these households? So that's what I'm going to look at today. Starting with just a review of some of these previous results, and I'll try to move through this quickly. Again, believing that a number of you have probably seen these results in that article. So just a quick summary of what PSA looked like in the initial years that we're studying, how we collected data in this case study region of Sarapiquí, and what we found in terms of impacts on forest cover. And then move on to the new question. And again, we're looking for evidence of causal impacts on these farm management variables. So we'll look at what variables we chose, how we estimated those impacts, and what the impacts are that we found, and then talk a little bit about interpreting those. Okay, so the program of Pago para Servicios Ambientales was set up in a 1996 law and then initiated in 1997. And we're going to look at contracts that were signed in the first 2 years of the program, in 1997 and 1998. In those years, the program was essentially offering contracts on a first-come, first-served basis to landowners who volunteered to participate in the program and were able to produce a cadastral map from the National Land Registry and then could hire a topographer or cartographer to map out the proposed contract area and a forester to come up with a forest management plan. So if they could do that and they could turn in their application, they usually got the contract. And it was for 5 years, and in those years it was paying about $43 per hectare per year. And over those first 2 years, nationwide, Costa Rica signed up about 137,000 hectares of forest land for forest protection contracts. Now, if you're familiar with the literature on PSA or the program itself, you know that it's a larger program. It involves not only forest protection contracts, and you also have read that the program has evolved over time. It's no longer just first come, first serve. The contract payment has changed. It's now a higher payment. So this doesn't reflect the current status of PSA, but we think this is still of interest because this gives us the longest time frame to look for impacts. So these contracts that happened in the first couple years. So in order to look for those impacts, we focused on the Sarapiquí region, which you can see in the map there at the top. We chose that basically because there's this NGO Fundacor working in the region, and Fundacor had this plan of identifying areas where deforestation was more likely and then trying to recruit landowners in those areas to sign up for the PSA. So we thought that in that area we were more likely to see an impact, but recognized that that impact would be hard to pick up just by comparing farms with contracts versus other farms, because they were in fact targeting the farms more likely to deforest. Okay, so this was a good case for us. You needed a good evaluation method in order to be able to tease out these impacts, but we thought we were more likely to see impacts here. So how did we collect data? We interviewed a sample of landowners. So we drew on Fundacor's records. So in the map here, you can see the orange polygons are the farms that had PSA contracts. We obtained that information from Fundacor. And then we went to the National Registry. Remember, you had to be in the National Registry to sign up for a contract to identify other farms that didn't have contracts. We did that a few different ways, trying to pre-match to get a good sample of control farms that were similar to the farms that had signed up. So this map shows you one example of how we did that. We mapped out these donuts essentially around the farms of PSA, and then we randomly selected farms from the National Registry in those donuts. So close enough to be in a similar market and biophysical setting, but not right next door where you might think there would be spillover effects. Okay, so we had ended up with 50 farms that had contracts in those first 2 years, and 150 farms without contracts of any kind ever up to 2005. And I should note those 50 farms that had signed up in 97, 98, they still had contracts in 2005. Remember, it's a 5-year program, so these are farms that had renewed. In addition to doing surveys with these 200 farms, Rodrigo also did in-depth interviews and farm visits with selected landowners to get some more contextual information. And we used aerial photographs to get information on the forest cover. So we had aerial photographs from 1986, 92, and 2005. 92 because that was the closest year to the start of the program where there wasn't too much cloud cover. Right, so it would have been nicer to have aerial photographs from, say, 96, but there was too much cloud cover in those cases. So this is what the forest cover data from the aerial photographs looks like. You see declining forest cover in both PSA farms on top and non-PSA on bottom from 1986 to 1992, and then the trends diverge. So we looked at whether that is a real effect. And just a brief summary then of the previous results on forest cover. So we found that among those 50 PSA farms, forest cover went up by about 11 hectares between 97 and 2005. On the other farms, that whole set of controls, forest cover went down by about 2 hectares. Okay, so we found net reforestation versus net deforestation, reflecting that graph I just showed you. So if we follow a sort of partial identification logic and just think intuitively about this, again, these are landowners that volunteered for the program. So they signed up voluntarily for a program to not deforest. Okay, so we think it's logical to say that the landowners that voluntarily signed up for a program to not deforest probably weren't going to deforest any more than the landowners that didn't sign up for it. Right? So we think that if they hadn't signed up for the program, the most that they would have deforested would be that average deforestation in the other farms. So unlikely that the people who were planning to deforest a lot signed up for a program to say you had to stop deforesting. And then the second sort of intuitive assumption we make there is that once you signed up for the program that's paying you to stop deforestation, it seems likely that the impact of that wouldn't be to increase deforestation. Okay, so let's say that the impact is going to be 0 at worst or greater. It's going to tend to push you towards more forest as opposed to less forest. And that gives us these bounds that we think the impact should be somewhere between 0 and 12.72, which is that 10.74 plus 1.98. So that gives us some intuitive bounds on what we think the impact should be of having a contract on a farm, and what we actually come up with, I'll just focus on this particular estimate, is if you have a contract on a farm, you end up after, 8 years, 97 to 2005, with about 10 hectares more of forest. Okay, and that's a post-matching regression estimate. Okay, so that's our forest cover estimate. And just to tell you how we get to that, the matching is based on these variables, which we selected largely based on Rodrigo's in-depth interviews, thinking about what would drive selection into the program. So how much forest you have is going to matter, but also opportunity cost is reflected in things like slope, and access to markets, which tend to be bundled together with access to information and services which might help you sign up for the program, such as distance to forestry office, and then also whether you had previously participated in other forestry programs. Rodrigo found was likely to predict whether you would sign up for PSA. Okay, so that was the previous analysis. So we use these same variables for matching, again, to look at changes in farm management and livelihoods. But we add in baseline levels of our indicators of farm management. Let's look at these actually, and these are the overall descriptive statistics. But here we have them broken down by the farms with PSA contracts versus the other farms. And I can see my animation isn't working here, so let's start at the top, unlike where the animation is directing you to. So we wanted to look at things like the cost of implementing the program. So one thing the program asks you to do is protect the forest that's under contract. So we looked at whether the forest was fenced in 1996 and whether it was fenced in 2005. And you see that in PSA farms, fencing increases, but also in non-PSA farms, it increases. We looked at other indicators of farm management. So this is a ranching area. We looked at the count of cattle, and you see that the cattle goes down in the PSA farms and goes up in the non-PSA farms. Likewise with labor, labor hired onto the farm goes down on PSA farms and goes up on non-PSA farms. So those are all indicators of farm management. Then we also looked at, sort of with this exit from agriculture, if this is happening, does that mean that they're moving off the farm? So we looked at the proportion of landowners that were living on the farm versus absentee. And these numbers are correct here. So you see in 1996, only 27% of the landowners in the PSA program were living on a farm. So a lot of absentee landowners. And actually there were fewer in 2005 in the PSA sample, but it increased in the non-PSA sample. Okay, so these are the indicators we're going to look at in terms of looking at how PSA impacts potential mechanisms or potential farm management strategies and livelihood strategies that might then lead to that change in forest cover. So you might ask, why this selection of indicators? Well, so a key issue is how do we gather the data on these indicators? I told you we did a survey, and in the discussion earlier, the sense was, well, if you can do a survey, you can get exactly the information you want. Well, that's true to some degree, but we needed the baseline information, right? And so we restricted ourselves to indicators here where it seemed plausible that we could get accurate recall data on 1996. So it seemed plausible to us that landowners could tell us accurately whether they were living on the farm in 96, how many cattle they had, whether the forest was fenced and whether they were hiring labor. But not as plausible to think that we could get things like how many workers did you hire, how were the cattle distributed across different fields on your farm, and so forth. So that's how we got to these indicators. Like I said, the animation not quite working. Okay, so what do we do with those? It's covariate matching using the genetic matching approach, one-to-one nearest neighbor with replacement. And here's the balance table. Sorry for the size of the font. PowerPoint and I were not getting along yesterday. But this just reinforces, I think, Jan's point from yesterday that you never get perfect balance. So the balance gets better here if you look at the sort of the central tendency and the difference of the empirical quantile plots and the cumulative distribution. You see in general balance getting better, but with some exceptions down here at the bottom, we still have a problem with the asset count, which is one of our indicators of welfare. So after matching, we're going to do multivariate regressions to adjust for those remaining imbalances. So we're going to use that match sample, include all of the covariates that we used in matching, and then run an OLS regression to look at change in cattle herd, and use ordered logit to look at changes in fencing, labor, and residence. Remember, you could either have fenced in 96 or not, and you could have fenced in 2005 or not. So we're going to look at ordered logit for how you changed between 1996 and 2005. Okay, and here are the results then. So starting out with cattle here, again, this is the regression estimate, and you see a fairly large and statistically significant negative effect. So PSA means that you were likely to have reduced your cattle herd relative to what non-PSA were doing. Okay, the others are all from those ordered logit, so you see the marginal effects for each transition. So for forest fencing, for example, well, for each of them, there are 4 different categories. For fencing, you could have gone from fenced previously to not fenced. You could have let your fences degrade. Or you could have stayed fenced. You could have gone from not fenced previously and just stayed not fenced. Or you could have been not fenced in 1996 and added fencing around your forest by 2005. So the general pattern here is that we see PSA makes you less likely to have moved into fencing. Right? So negative coefficients on those 2 categories of going into fencing in 2005. Likewise, in hired labor, less likely, if you've got PSA contracts, to have moved into hiring labor in 2005. Okay, so negative coefficients on those transitions into hiring labor. And those are statistically significant, at least at the 10% level across the different transitions. If we look down here at changes in absenteeism, whether you live on the property or not, you see those effects aren't significant. Okay, so we see a reduction in cattle, and we see a reduction in hiring labor. So these are farmers who've signed up for PSA. That means they're getting additional cash, but clearly they're not using it to buy cattle, and they're not using it to hire more people. So could they be using it then to buy consumer durables or for more consumption to increase their welfare? So that's the last set of variables we look at here. So we asked them about a series of consumer durables, and we constructed it with a count and then a first principle component of that as a measure of socioeconomic welfare. And then we just asked them, is your quality of life better now compared to 1996? Okay, and these are the raw results, and then here is the post-covariate matching. Again, the very bottom line here is the results of an OLS on the consumer durables, and then the ordered logit on stated welfare. Again, the font size is small here, but the take-home message is nothing is significant. There's no impact on these. Okay, so in summary, what do we have? So it looks like having a PSA contract did in some sense encourage an exit from agriculture. That was the mechanism for getting to more forest cover. We see reduced cattle herd and less hiring of farm labor. But we don't see any evidence that encouraged people to exit the farm entirely. There's no increase in absenteeism. And we see no evidence of an impact on welfare as measured by consumer durables or the stated quality of life. Okay, so why did we care about this? We wanted to know if this made our forest cover results plausible and we wanted to know if these were desirable. Okay, so the reducing cattle and reducing hired labor, that's plausible. So if you've got more area under forest, less in crops, less in pasture, makes sense that you would get there by having less cattle and hiring fewer farm workers. Desirable? Well, maybe desirable from an environmental perspective, right? It means that you're not just overgrazing other areas, you're not hiring labor to go intensify agricultural production in other areas of your farm, you're actually exiting agriculture. How about the second one? So not as desirable, perhaps, not to see any impacts on socioeconomic welfare. There's a lot of hope out there that PES would increase welfare of rural producers. We don't see any evidence of that. How about plausibility of that? Also, it doesn't seem as plausible to me in that, remember, these were landowners that voluntarily re-enrolled in PSA. So what we're finding is no beneficial impacts of a program that they signed up for more than once. Okay, that doesn't make as much sense to us, so what could be the possible explanations here? Well, it may be that they signed up, but they didn't understand what the costs were, and so somehow the costs were greater than they thought. Or it could be that we didn't measure the benefits accurately. We don't really believe the cost story because, again, they re-enrolled. They knew what the costs were. The program didn't change that radically, so they should have understood what the costs were. We don't see them investing a lot in fencing. What they say they had to do was build trails around the forest, but that's also what they say Fundacor helped with. So how about on the benefits side? Well, we think we looked at a good range of benefits, including this sort of stated change in welfare. We don't see anything there. But one thing that perhaps we did miss is this sense of being recognized for your contribution to conserving forests. And we did find that looking just at the participants, about 70% said that was the reason they signed up for PSA, environmental reasons as opposed to economic reasons. Related to that, in Rodrigo's in-depth interviews, a lot of landowners said PSA was interesting as a way to help demonstrate that they were really using that forest and it was theirs. And only less than a third of the landowners had secured title in this, in our sample. Okay, so at this point in the PSA, you didn't have to have actual title in order to sign up for PSA. And so it seems like getting recognition for your forest conservation was almost also getting recognition that you really own that forest, and perhaps giving them greater tenure security. Also, maybe also strengthening their connection to Fundacor, to this really strong NGO in the region, by doing something that they wanted you to do, signing up, so building your social networks, securing your land tender, and getting some sort of warm glow from conservation. Okay, so last slide, Kathy. So why does this matter? Well, there's been a lot of discussion recently about how PES may crowd out intrinsic environmental motivations. So one way to think about this is really sort of the opposite happening. We think what we're seeing maybe is that environmental motivations are crowding in PES. Maybe even that's one of the key benefits for landowners that contract for PES, in part because maybe it's bundled together with these other benefits, like tenure security and connections with Fundacor, right? This all goes together. You're being recognized for your forest conservation, you're getting these other benefits with it. Of course, this is speculation. I didn't present any evidence to tell you that these are what's happening there, so this is a great area for future research. Thank you.